Today on Market Journal. After the floods, many farmers are left with acres of fields in need of repair. Learn some things you can do to make your land healthy again. Responsible farmers don't just throw away their used pesticide containers. We'll tell you some ways to dispose of them properly. And proper soil temperature and planting depth are just a couple things that need to be followed this time of year. Our expert shares some other advice to make this growing season a success. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you could be here for our first show of May. And to begin our broadcast, planting has kept many folks busy throughout the state, but for others, the flooding from earlier this year makes that impossible. Fields have been given a chance to dry out, however, that's only the first step. Market Journal went on the road to Tekamah, Nebraska to learn what management options producers need to know to repair their fields and make them productive again. For Burt County Extension's John Wilson, the 2019 Nebraska flood was all too familiar. He was on this very field in 2011 to help farmers that were impacted when the Missouri River crested. This event is different than the one 8 years ago, but what was learned about how to bring a flooded field back into production is still relevant. It all boils down to three separate phases.
The first was to remove any debris, and we could have a number of different kinds of debris that we found in fields. After we had the debris removed, we needed to repair erosion. Depending on the depth of erosion, that the process might be a little bit different. And finally, we had a whole group of other considerations that included compaction, getting a cover crop going to prevent wind erosion, and other factors.
When removing any debris that washed up on your field, John puts it into two categories, plant and other. If plant debris is just a few inches, that can be incorporated back into the field with normal tillage. However, if the debris is too thick and the land is zoned as agricultural, farmers have other options too.
If we spread it out, if we can get it dry, that burning is an option. And a lot of folks have burned corn stalks this year. If we have too deep of a layer of corn stalks, that we may have to burn it off once, let the next layer down, dry, and then burn it again.
Other debris, like tires, boards, and metal, must be taken to a landfill or buried. As for sediment, the depth of the sedimentation determines what you do next.
Maybe an inch or two up to about 8 inches, that we can incorporate that with normal tillage. The thing that we have to remember is however deep the sand is, that we want to till about 1.5 times that depth to incorporate it into the soil. We don't want to leave a layer in the field that's a completely different texture than the parent or native soil below that.
After the land is cleared, a farmer can decide how to manage soil erosion, which can range from a few inches to several feet.
In those deeper areas, a lot of times we would use sand and sediment that might have been deposited in other areas of the field, fill in those eroded areas to within about 3 feet of the surface of the soil, and then borrow topsoil from other areas in the field to finish filling in the eroded area. That'll help with when we get ready to plant crop back in the field.
A producer may also want to consider planting cover crops once conditions allow for it. Studies show cover crops may impact yields in some rotations and can reduce wind erosion.
The cover crops helped build back up the microorganism population in the soil, and probably the biggest benefit we saw was helping stabilize the sand and soil to prevent wind erosion.
And one more note about cover crops. John said studies in 2012 were done on the field where we conducted our interview. He said that research did show a significant yield increase, particularly with corn. Moving on, and renew, reuse, and recycle. It's a phrase that should be on everyone's mind these days, and that's especially true if you're applying pesticides to your newly emerging crops. As the season progresses and crop protection products are applied, the handling and disposal of pesticide containers deserves its fair share of attention. Nebraska Extension educator Clyde came by to offer some tips for recycling used pesticide containers and where they can be dropped off.
The pesticide container recycling program's been ongoing now for 25 plus years, and we try to encourage folks to recycle those empty pesticide containers rather than throwing them in a landfill or in the road ditch or wherever.
So how can somebody find out where to drop off the containers?
Yeah, we have a list of those cooperators on our website, and it's a good idea to go check there. Some of them require appointments, others have hours listed, some are only seasonal availability of sites as well.
And I'm sure you can't just take the container right in. There's got to be some preparation beforehand. What kind of prep do you have to do?
Right, so just standard operating procedures. You triple rinse or pressure rinse your containers as you add them to the tank, and all of that rinse water that comes out of there should go right into the tank and used in that way. So those containers have to be clean and dried. If it has a plastic label on it, remove that. The caps should be rinsed and disposed of separately. It's only the plastic container itself that can go into the program.
Gotcha. Any size restrictions on what you can dispose of?
Yeah, it's normally the 1 gallon, the 2.5 gallon are the standard, but we'll take all the way up to 55-gallon drum sizes. The bigger ones can be arranged for on a case-by-case basis, but those can't just be dropped off at the normal sites.
And maybe reinforce the importance of recycling as opposed to just throwing something away.
Right. I mean, you know, we all know that our landfills are expensive. We've got to protect those items in the landfill from rinsing into the groundwater and contaminating the countryside. So we want to minimize what we put into those landfills. So anything we can save from putting in there, it saved us in the long run expense, and the environment is better protected.
And we've been doing lots of stories about the flooding impacts a lot of different parts of agriculture, and pesticide is one of those things, especially I would think as far as storing pesticide before a flood.
Right, and you know, I talk about storage all the time, and I do use as an example planning ahead if a flood event does occur. And here's a great example this spring when we saw these totally unexpected flash floods and 500-year scale and so forth. And so you really do have to think about what potentially could flood in my area and plan your storage appropriately. You want to try to, as best as you can, put them in areas that aren't likely to flood.
The Ag Container Recycling Council, or ACRC, Executive Director Mark Hudson said in 2017 that Nebraska collected nearly 90,000 pounds of containers, which was approximately 28,000 pounds more than in 2016. For more information, you can visit pested.unl.edu/recycling. Time now for this week's trivia question, and temperatures, they're starting to warm up. Won't be too long before we bust out the grill for a nice cookout, so we wanted to know, more beef is eaten on this holiday than any other day of the year. Is it Memorial Day, Labor Day, July 4th, or is it Thanksgiving? Make your selection, and I'll have the answer after Al's forecast. Moving on to this week's market report, and planting continues to grab many of the headlines. Plus, corn and soybean futures are showing some interesting trends. And trade talks with China continue, but in the meantime, is South America looking to take our place in the export market? And finally, could African Swine Fever usher in more demand for beef? We'll look at it. Darin Newsom is our analyst this week. We sat down on Wednesday to get his take on futures, trade, and what's really gotten his attention this planting season.
You know, of course, the obvious answer is the weather. We continue to see some winter weather across upper plains, upper U.S. Midwest, out to the parts of western Nebraska and the Dakotas and so on. We're seeing flooding right now along the Mississippi River. Weather is the key issue. How soon will we get planted? Will we get planted? All of these things are up in the air at this point. And we really can't do anything in the grain markets, particularly in corn, soybeans, and even spring wheat, until we start to get a better feel for what the weather is going to be 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks down the road.
Looking at the monthly charts here, maybe the weekly charts, corn futures, what are you seeing here?
In the weekly charts, not seeing a lot. They're just going sideways, but the real interest, if I apply my Goldilocks principle, which is daily charts are too short, monthly charts are too long, but weekly charts are just right. I'm going to break that rule. I'm going to look at the daily chart here today, and what we see is short-term uptrends in both old crop July corn and new crop December. These started late last week. So what it does is it gives us an opportunity. It gives us some hope, and I know that's a 4-letter word, but it's something that we haven't seen in quite some time, to where we can build a little bit of buying interest in here. Now, do I think we're going to see funds erase this huge position that they've got, this huge net short position? Absolutely not. They're very comfortable with it. They know the fundamentals just as well as we do. They know that at some point all of this grain on storage that was reported in the March quarterly stocks report is going to move to town. But for now, that grain's being held pretty tight. It's giving a reason to buy the market in here. Again, short-term uptrend.
And what are we looking at with soybeans?
Soybeans, just an ugly, ugly situation right now. We've been moving to new lows. It continues to chew to new lows all the time. We aren't getting any fresh, bullish news out of the trade talks that are going on this week, unless something happens, but we haven't seen anything other than the fact the president keeps threatening to walk away from the table. Now, whether or not this is just gamesmanship, and it very well could be, but that's really the only news that we've seen this week, and it's not really bringing a lot of buyers back to the market.
Do you think there's a growing concern that the U.S. may lose their market share, especially soybeans, to South America?
Yes. And this isn't just this marketing year. I think this is a long-term deal. We could have a trade deal, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going back to square one and we're going to be 50% of the equation of feeding soybeans into China. I just don't see that happening right away. So yeah, I think it's a problem. I think it's a changed landscape that we're going to have to deal with. We talked about, for the last 10, 15 years about this demand market that gave us new price objectives in corn. I think we're looking at the flip side of that coin, a new demand market or the lack of demand market that's going to change our price objectives long term in soybeans as well.
Okay, and want to spend a couple minutes talking about African Swine Fever. That's something that we've been following for months now on our show, and it looks to me like the U.S. is kind of starting to take more of a proactive role in keeping this disease as far away as possible. So first off, kind of give us an update, if you could, on where we stand with African swine fever in China and the pork market as a whole.
Well, number one, we don't know exactly how bad the situation is in China. It seems to get worse with every report that we see. Now, as far as the pork situation as a whole, I know there are some alarmists out there that are saying this is going to change the landscape of the meat industry forever. I'm not there yet. We've seen a short supply spike in the pork, in the lean hog market. It jumped up and now it's come back down. We could see a demand market. May not. But I do think it's something that is going to continue to provide support to the overall pork industry here in the United States. Whether or not it changes everything as dramatically long term is yet to be seen.
Any advice for pork producers here?
If they didn't get that top in the June contract here from a couple weeks ago, I think they're going to have another opportunity. This thing's not over yet. We're going to continue to get stories, but remember, we can rebuild hog herds, at least here domestically, very quickly, so we can ramp up our supplies. Again, it'll take a few months, but we can do it. We can ramp up our supplies. Then it comes down to, are we going to be able to ship them? Is the trade problems going to make it so we have trouble shipping these oversupplies that we could produce? I think these are all this is all things that we're going to have to watch going forward.
Do you think over time this will make beef even more in demand? Maybe somebody's thinking, oh, well, I can't get pork, I'll just eat more beef.
Possibly here domestically. You know, if we're shipping more of our pork overseas, that could very well increase our demand for beef. Do I think it's going to increase shipments of beef to, say, China and so on? I don't think so. They're pretty pork and poultry centric. Now, it could certainly help their poultry industry. Then, of course, we always have the poultry diseases that go through as well. So I think it is changing. I think it could change some of the demand situations that we see in the meat industry as a whole. Do I think it's going to be this earth-shattering, as some are calling it, game-changing event? No, not at this time. I want to see how quickly we react in increasing our hog supplies before we can say, you know, this thing's going to be lasting decades.
And Darin, before we let you go, any marketing or risk management advice that you want to leave us with today?
Soybeans are very difficult right now. I mean, you really can't jump out and do anything at this point. You have to hope that we get, again, there's that four-letter word, but you have to hope for something to happen, something to give the market a reason to rally. In corn, if we don't have anything done, I think we're going to have an opportunity here in the coming days and weeks, again, due to that short-term rally, to get some new crop on. It's all going to be weather-dependent. Wheat, the best that we can hope for at this point is to see some sort of post-harvest, because we're just getting ready to move into harvest, get into some sort of post-harvest rally. Other than that, you know, I'm hearing a lot of talk about just selling across the scales. That's usually not my favorite thing to do, but in wheat, you might not have any choice.
Thanks to Darin for coming on the show. Always love to hear what he has to say. Moving on, and rainfall from early March ranged from 2.5 to 4 inches in the Grand Island area, where there still was about 25 inches of frost in the ground. Now, even though Hall County and the surrounding areas didn't have the same record snowfall that other parts of Nebraska did leading up to this year's intense flooding, flood control structures in the area also helped protect farmland and commercial and residential property in the area. You can read about flood control structures in the Central Platte Natural Resources District that helped mitigate flooding in the May Nebraska Farmer. Time now for Al's forecast, and Al, we made it to May. It's that time of year when people have got a lot riding on the forecast. What do you have for us this week?
Well, Troy, you are correct. We are into May, and it is crunch time in terms of planting. This is when things really start to hit the road in terms of farmers getting very concerned if we continue to see this wet pattern. And unfortunately, this last week brought significant moisture to much of the central and eastern corn belt. Here in Nebraska, it depended on where you were. If you were in the northeast, portions of central, north-central Nebraska, northern panhandle, and portions of the southwest and southern panhandle, you may have received between 1 and 2 inches of moisture during this last week. But in a lot of areas south of Interstate 80, particularly southwest, south central, and portions of southeast Nebraska, really did not see significant moisture, less than a quarter of an inch. The only areas in southeast Nebraska that had significant moisture was essentially south and east of a line from Beatrice to Nebraska City, where we'd had some localized heavier precipitation. So as we go through this weekend, we are expecting at least a little bit drier pattern, but things all of a sudden turn to the worst again next week. So I hate to give this forecast, but it does look like wetness is going to be in our store for our future, and we would expect further planting delay issues if this indeed comes to fruition. So as we look at the upper air models for today, we have the upper air low over south central Canada, responsible for the cool press of conditions into the northern plains, and some of that reaching into northern Nebraska. And we also have high pressure system over South Dakota and also over eastern Oklahoma, with low pressure starting to develop in eastern Colorado. Models are trying to develop a little bit of precipitation, particularly this afternoon and this evening, and then that will start to intensify as we go through the overnight hours, and we get a conversion of 2 jet streams over the state. Might give us just enough lift with the Texas low pressure system at the surface developing, helping to feed a little bit of moisture in this region. Isolated thunderstorms are not out of the question in eastern Nebraska, and that will regress to our east. And we should have a fairly dry day on Monday for the most part, as we start to see low pressure eject out of that trough in the southwest over southwestern portions of Kansas. We'll start to see that moisture increasing probably very late in the afternoon and the overnight hours as the main thunderstorms develop across Kansas. This trough really intensifies on Tuesday, brings a big slug of energy up into our region with low pressure over southwest Kansas and southern Texas, really helping to pump the moisture up into the central plains. So some of the storm development across northern Kansas and eastern Nebraska is likely and spreading toward the east as the day progresses. By Wednesday, that low pressure still is in the upper atmosphere. Trough sticks in the southwest, but we see a piece of energy ejecting out with an associated surface low in southwest Kansas. That's going to give us another round of widespread thunderstorm activity. Most of this centered across the state of Nebraska and South Dakota. And then as we get into the day on Thursday, that low pressure system finally starts to show some movement. It kicks its energy out to the east of us as we see low pressure over central Missouri. It is still going to wrap around with some precipitation around it, but it looks like most of this precipitation will move out during the second half of the day. And then on Friday, we're left in its wake with just a weak wave moving across our region as high pressure settles in. So at least we get a break from the precipitation as most of it moves off to our east. Now, in regards to the 8 to 10 to 14-day forecast, basically looking for next Tuesday, the following Tuesday, cooler than normal conditions continue as we still deal with a northern jet across the northern plains, lesser odds across to the south of us, and in terms of precipitation, the heaviest moisture basically from the southwest to the southern plains, lesser probabilities for above normal moisture here in eastern Nebraska. Now, I'll be gone next week, so looking at the forecast for the following week, it does look like we get a break from precipitation next weekend, and the models once again show a very active pattern for the following week. So these planting delay issues are likely to continue into the foreseeable future, Troy.
Thanks, Al. Back to trivia now, and this week we asked, what's the holiday when people eat the most beef? The answer is Memorial Day. Hey, that's later this month. 4th of July and Labor Day usually tie for second place. It's no secret that what happens during planting season sets the tone for producers during the remainder of the growing season. And 2019 has been a tough year for many of the state's farmers. I talked with Nebraska Extension Educator Jenny Rees to hear how producers can get the growing season started on the right track.
So I'd say in general, whether they're soybean or corn growers, that everything we do at planting sets the stage for the rest of the season. So we're going to be talking about some things that would be considerations to make sure that we start off the season right.
So when it comes to soil temperature, what are some things that we need to remember here?
So soil temperatures, we'd really like to see those soil temperatures around 50 degrees for the first 48 hours or warmer for the first 48 hours after that seed goes in the ground. Soybean, because they imbibe or basically take up water so quickly, that critical period may be more like 24 hours, but we still say preferably 48 hours. Ways that they can check soil temperatures can be through cropwatch.unl.edu on the soil temperature site. And then also, I've just really been recommending that growers take temperatures for their own field conditions. And they can do that by simply using a meat thermometer as well and just have a good idea.
And any reminders that you'd like to share about planting depth?
Yeah, so planting depth for corn and soybeans, we've been recommending around at least 1.5 inches to 2 inches deep. For corn, it's more critical because the corn needs to be able to set its brace roots, and it's just too important for correct root establishment. We actually have research for soybean seeding depth as well, and found that 1.75 inches gave us the highest yields based on our research. So that surprises growers, but perhaps as they think about planting earlier, it's something where that seed is in more buffered soil for moisture and temperature conditions.
And when we talk about soybean seeding rates, any new research here that we need to know about?
Yeah, we actually have 12 years of research from Nebraska on soybean seeding rates. It's something that growers always seem to be interested in. And so what we found consistently over 12 years, combining all the data, that there's only 0.6 bushel an acre yield difference between seeding at 120,000 seeds per acre or 180,000 seeds per acre. So our recommendations there would be if a grower is planting over 150,000 seeds per acre, consider dropping down to at least 140,000 seeds per acre and just see how that works for them. Otherwise, if they're less than 150,000, we'd recommend planting at 120,000 seeds per acre, aiming for a final plant stand of 100,000 plants per acre, and they shouldn't see any yield differences.
Gotcha. And finally, any tips that you'd like to leave us with today on salvaging flood damaged grain? Because this is a question that we've been getting a lot of.
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of questions on this too. Not necessarily from the soybean side, but from the corn side of it. And so, first of all, safety is most important. Cutting all power to that bin site, making sure that they have a professional electrician, make sure there's nothing charged still. Making sure that, in a lot of cases it may be more maybe wiser to have a professional salvage company come in and do this because they're used to these situations. The key thing with this is if they're going to salvage grain, they have to do it from the top and the sides of the bin. They can never take it from the bottom portion of the bin. The reason for that is flooded grain, meaning flood waters from rivers and streams, is considered contaminated. Thus, any grain that came in contact with those flood waters up to a foot above where that water occurred on that flooded bin is considered adulterated, and it can't go into the marketplace and be fed or sold.
Really good advice. Thanks to Jenny for being on the show. For our final story today, the Lincoln Embassy Suites was the site of this year's AgrAbility National Training Workshop. This was the workshop's 28th year and first time being hosted in Nebraska. Over 200 agricultural producers with disabilities or chronic illness, their families, and professional staff were all invited. They came out to learn about new assistive farm technology, network with others, attend sessions, hear speakers, and more. John Dvorak farms about 500 acres north of Grand Island. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 14 years ago and doesn't think he'd still be farming if not for AgrAbility. He's grateful for the services provided and the chance to share his story with other farmers.
For me, sitting in a tractor, something like that, I get so tense and whatnot, like planning and stuff, so they helped me out with like the guidance system for the tractor and whatnot, and that made it so I could stay in the tractor quite a bit longer then, and get some ground covered during the day. I've already talked to a couple from Florida, and their son has Parkinson's, and it's amazing how much, swapping stories and whatnot, you can actually gain from that, because they might have one problem that you really don't perceive as being a problem, but yet it is for them and it isn't for you. And you can help them out by giving them ideas what they possibly could do or what agencies they can contact or whatever there.
For more information on Nebraska AgrAbility, visit agrability.unl.edu. That's going to do it for this week's show. Next week, who needs herbicide when you've got flames? We'll turn up the heat to eliminate weeds from your fields. And whether it's sand, silt, or clay, see how the soil stacks up when it's put to the test. That plus much, much more next week. Until then, I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.